The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
In the last decade, the U.S. federal budget deficit grew substantially and now stands at a level not seen since the vast government expenditures of World War II. As the government continues to spend stimulus funds to aid the ailing economy, along with growing obligations to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, it is likely that deficits will increase further. What will these growing deficits mean for the future of popular government programs that benefit the poor and middle class? And how should the U.S. respond to the growing portion of the nation's debt that is owed to foreign countries? Joining us to discuss the U.S. budget situation is Robert Reischauer, president of the Urban Institute and former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Bob Reischauer. Welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
You're the president of the Urban Institute, and I went and looked it up, and the Urban Institute was established during the Great Society, I think at the behest of Lyndon Johnson.
Correct. Lyndon Johnson was worried that policymakers didn't have analytical information to guide them after the urban riots in the mid-1960s, set up a high-level private commission to ask whether there should be an organization established to provide this independent analysis and research on domestic problems affecting big city areas. The commission said yes, and Lyndon Johnson set up, in a sense, the Urban Institute as a private, nonprofit organization.
That was more than 40 years ago.
42 years ago.
Many things have changed. What's the Urban Institute focus on now?
Well, it became clear rather early in the Urban Institute's history that looking at domestic problems through the lens of city, suburb, rural area really wasn't the right way to look at these things. Rather than look at problems on a place basis, we began to look at them on a vulnerable population basis. There are vulnerable populations living throughout America. The policies that we came up with, like Medicaid, food stamps, housing assistance, weren't place specific. They were everywhere. And so the Urban Institute is really focused on those types of interactions between public policy and low-income and vulnerable populations.
You, do I say, came to that job? You went to that job after a notable career in research and government, including being the director of the Congressional Budget Office, which we hear about a lot these days, partly because of the, quote, scoring of the health care bill. I'd like to talk about health care later, but the Congressional Budget Office also reports, as does the Office of Management and Budget, about the federal budget. So if I can, let's talk a little bit about the budget, the deficit, and where America is going with both of those.
There's a real question on where it's going with respect to the budget because we need to make some very tough decisions, and we aren't willing to make them right now. We are running deficits, which is the difference between the revenues that are coming into the government and the spending that's going out, that are at historic levels. We haven't run imbalances of this magnitude since World War II. And it is a situation that is quite simply unsustainable. We can't continue doing this. No one can tell you how long our time frame is. Is it 3 years, 5 years? It's certainly not 20 years. It's closer than that, that we are going to have to make some very, very fundamental changes in either the level of taxation that we've been willing to tolerate over the previous 40 or 50 years, or the kinds of services that we expect from our government.
Yeah, let's back up for a little bit for a minute. So our budget problems are essentially a 1-2 punch. The most recent one is the financial collapse or near collapse and federal spending that had to fill the gap.
And tax cuts.
And tax cuts.
And that explains why we're having these deficits of historic proportions. But we knew and have known for several decades that sometime in the not too distant future, 2020s, 2030s, the retirement of the baby boom generation and the costs of the programs that our government provides to the elderly and the disabled, we're going to run up our spending to levels that weren't supported by the tax revenue that we pay.
So according to Congressional Budget Office projections, I looked them up this morning, CBO, just rounding, in 10 years' time, we'll have a $10 trillion deficit?
No,
debt.
No,
debt.
the
10
debt
trillion will be $10 trillion.
Will be $10 trillion well, it's actually $9 trillion now. It's going to be more than that in 10 years. And I think that that's just not going to come about. We're going to have to make some decisions on our own, or they're going to be forced on us by world markets.
Let's go. Let's just see this. If we do nothing, what happens?
Well, our basic problem is that we as a nation don't save very much. So when the government runs a deficit, it has to go and borrow money from foreigners. Half of the debt that our government has out is owned by foreigners. 2/3 of the debt that we've issued over the last 10 years has been bought by foreigners. So we're highly dependent on the willingness of foreigners to buy our debts.
Well, Herb Stein, who we both knew and loved, used to say he didn't know what we were so worried about. They send us their cars and TV sets, and we send them little green pieces of paper. He said, if they don't want any more paper, we'll stop sending them paper. I think that was his way of saying, well, we would just inflate our currency.
Well, inflation has a cost on all of us, on society, and that certainly isn't, where we want to go. I mean, we can have high interest rates. We could have a collapse of the dollar. We could have very, very high inflation, and pick your poison. I mean, none of those.
But that is on the when people talk in Washington, they do talk about inflation as being one of the at least partial options here. Isn't that right?
Yes, but inflation used to be a better escape route from the kind of situation we're in right now, because we didn't. If we go back 30 years, 25 years, we didn't have a tax system that adjusted automatically for increases in inflation, and we didn't adjust benefits like Social Security benefits or food stamp benefits for changes in inflation. But when we have both of those things built in, it doesn't help the deficit situation that much.
You said something very interesting a minute ago, and I've heard you in other places talk about us being, and the phrase you used was, a fiscal slave to creditor nations like China. Can you expand on that a little bit?
We're highly dependent on the inflow of foreign capital to preserve our government and our standards of living. Those governments, or the foreign lenders, some of them don't share our political values. They have very different geopolitical aims and objectives than we do. And you ask yourself, do you want to live in a country where when our president wants to meet with the Dalai Lama, we have to look over our shoulder and say, what will the Chinese think? Or when we want to sell arms to South Korea or Taiwan, we have to have diplomats in other countries say, is this okay? We're not too far away from the point where we might say, we want energy independence. We want to invest in a way that will reduce our demand for foreign oil. Some of our bonds are bought by Middle East oil exporters. They might say, well, why are we lending you money so you can develop independence from our basic export product? This is all very complicated. It will play out in very subtle ways, but it's not a world I think any of us should want to live in.
A moment ago you said that we'd have to raise taxes. Let's talk about taxes short of anything else. If we just raise taxes to do this, how much would we have to raise taxes?
Well, if we take the Obama's budget and say it's all adopted and we go out 10 years to 2020, we will have a gap between our revenues and our expenditures of about $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion. That will be something like a 25–30% increase in taxes. We have made a lot of changes in our tax system over the last decade or so. And when it comes to something like the income tax, after the various credits that were adopted last year and the Obama administration would like to extend, 47% of the filing units in America don't owe any income tax.
They pay FICA. They pay the Social Security.
They pay Social Security tax, and they get a Social Security benefit that it's a good investment for them. But in our desire to relieve people with little means from tax burdens, we've absolved a large fraction of our population from paying income taxes anyway. We have also lowered the income taxes of the top 5 to 10% of the population very, very dramatically over the last 15 or so years, at a time when their piece of the pie has grown and grown rather dramatically. The fraction of income that goes to the top 10% of Americans is higher than it was in the 1920s. So it's higher than it's ever been since the 1920s. So we've lowered taxes on those with little income, those with lots of income, at a time that we want to expand the services that all of us enjoy.
So 25% or more increase in taxes. And we haven't even...
But I mean, that's not the right way to do it.
I know, I'm just trying to get us the...
Okay.
And I'm just trying to get the... We haven't even talked about what's happening in the states, where there are unfunded pensions, unfunded obligations of all sorts, many off the books and so forth. And when those come to roost, there'll be additional calls on revenues or whatever we're going to do. So these are big challenges on the revenue side.
I mean, we've basically been living beyond our means. It's been fun, but we're going to have to not just live within our means, but live a little bit below our means to compensate for the last 15 or so years. It's going to be tough. I mean, people are going to have to have a realistic view of what our options are. Now, there's a lot of inefficiencies in our government system and in our economy.
Are you going to name
in general.
names? You going to name names?
I'll name names, sure. There are lots of things which are probably relatively low priority. Now, the problem is always my low priority is not your low priority, and we have a democratic system and a very difficult time trying to work out exactly what do we as a nation regard as maybe something that we can do without. But I think if we don't do it ourselves over the next 5 to 10 years. Somebody else is going to do it for us.
I do want to ask you to name some names. What programs, there's all this talk about lowering the costs or bending the cost curve for Medicare. Let's put those to the side. Other things, though.
No, I was going to say, with respect to Medicare, which we'll talk about later, you know, there is a lot of unnecessary expenditures. There is a tremendous amount of unnecessary expenditures just in health care overall. I mean, the rough estimates are that 30% plus or minus of the procedures we get, the interventions we get, have no value or very low value, or are inappropriate and could you know, be scaled back. You look across the United States, there's huge variations in sort of the number of doctor visits for a given condition that have no relationship to outcomes. I mean, the people who go back every 2 weeks as opposed to every 4 weeks for some things are no healthier, don't have better outcomes, that kind of thing.
But that's just health. Mm-hmm. Where else in the budget?
Well, that's 17% of our budget, so you know, that's not a bad
I understand that.
Not a bad place to start. We give a lot of aid to state and local governments for things that you know, probably we shouldn't. That you know, they're more appropriately paid for at the state and local level because the benefits from them come from the local level. It might have been a good thing at the beginning to start this program, but get states interested in providing this kind of service, but then hand it off to them. On the other hand, there are things where we probably don't invest enough in the way of federal money to help state and local governments. And here I would argue that we should do a lot more on education, and I think this president is moving in that direction. But the future of this country is going to rest not just on whether we can strengthen our budget situation, but whether we can train and educate our young people to world-class standards, because they're going to have to compete in a market where others are doing a lot better job than we are.
What you're describing, though, sounds to me as if this is as much a political issue as a budgetary or economic. There's going to be.
Oh, I think it's more a political issue. It's you know, how does our political system respond in a rational way to the need to tighten its belt and improve efficiency? And that's not an easy thing to do in a democracy where the representatives of the people are elected every 2 years, and
in gerrymandered districts.
In gerrymandered districts, but in a country where there are huge variations in, you know, what seems to be the right thing. And we're all sitting here in suburban Washington, D.C., and what we think is necessary and desirable is very different from what we would be saying if we lived in rural Idaho, you know, or if we lived in Texas.
And Texas gets 2 senators, and Idaho gets 2 senators, which means we have to persuade.
And then we need 60 votes
and
to
we
do
need
anything,
60.
so it's even tougher.
So I know you're going to say the answer is education. Educating the American people, educating politicians.
I'm not, I guess I don't have a whole lot of faith in them, that. I think we have to scare people, and scare people by...
maybe education is a polite word for scare.
Well, I mean, you know, you can change the system either because of fear, greed, or education. And, you know, for many years, some of us have been sort of saying the same thing, you know, that we're on an unsustainable path. The sooner we begin dealing with this problem, the more manageable it is, the more gradually we can phase in the adjustments that we have to make, the less disruption there's going to be, the more control we as a nation will have over what things we do to close the budget gap.
What worries me, so you're a fearmonger, or you want to be a fearmonger, which is all right.
No, I want the members of Congress to be as concerned as I am about this, as fearful as I am about
All right, then,
this.
Ross Perot was a fearmonger.
Mm-hmm. And it worked.
And it worked.
And we had a president who came in who's, in his genetic material, he wanted to spend, but President Clinton, with some help from the Republicans in Congress, put together 2 deficit reduction packages. He got no help from the Republicans the first time, and we balanced the budget. And we ran small surpluses at the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s. That didn't mean that those of us who cared about this didn't look 20, 30 years out and say, with the baby boomers retiring, we're going to be in the pickle again. But we were having really an amazing debate 10 years ago, if you think about it. It was a debate where if we continued on the policies that we were on at that point, we were going to pay off the entire national debt by 2009. And if you remember, Alan Greenspan and others were saying, how can we conduct monetary policy if there is no public debt to buy and sell? And the answer to that was, well, what we'll do is the Federal Reserve will begin buying and selling Freddie Mac securities and GMAC securities and things like that. Well, they were right. You know, the Federal Reserve is buying and selling Freddie Mac. The only problem is the debt hasn't been paid off.
Do we have any major politicians today asking us to look at this? It seems to me the rhetoric is, we can pay for all this. Things are going to work out.
No, I think we have a number of politicians who are concerned about this. The chairman and ranking members of the budget committees are, who've been saying very much the same things that I'm saying. But we have a political system where when you get specific, when you say, well, I think maybe we should shave a little bit off of the benefits that upper income Social Security recipients receive, or I think we should tighten down on payments from Medicare to various kinds of providers, or maybe farm price supports are a little too generous. As soon as you begin getting specific like that, then somebody in your district who depends on farm price supports or has a large constituency of elderly beneficiaries on Social Security, an opponent will stand up and say, no, you don't have to do that. I can do it through reduction in fraud, waste, and abuse, or unneeded programs. And you know, if you're in Iowa and somebody says, well, what do you mean by unneeded programs? You say, urban mass transit aid. And if you're in New York City, you say farm price supports. And you can't get a consensus.
I think the Republican Congress only killed one farm support, the alpaca subsidy, if I remember correctly, and it was back in 3 years. Well,
that was in the 1990s. Yeah, right.
So give us the most hopeful scenario you have, and not just that people recognize the problem, but who politically, what political process happens?
Well, I think a president is going to have to be willing to sacrifice his or her second term and probably sacrifice his or her party majority in the Congress to get us to sit down and agree to do it. I had hoped that when we were debating the stimulus package and the financial bailouts, that the president might say, we have to do this, and I think we did. I think the policy was fine. But as we pass these tax cuts, these spending increases, at the same time, I want us to agree to pass legislation that 3 years from now will begin raising these taxes, will begin cutting these programs. And this is a package. You know, we'll do what we have to do now, but we'll commit ourselves to what we have to do over the long run. And we let that opportunity pass us by.
Big time.
Big time.
Well, on that cheery note, Bob Reischauer of the Urban Institute, former director of the Congressional Budget Office, thank you so much for being with us at the University of Maryland. And to our viewing audience, let me say thank you for tuning in. And if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to email us at policywatch@umd, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. Bob, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.